2-game winning streak I see for you.
Right, here we go. Content of this meeting is sent to a third party. Okay.
What?
We're live? All right. Well then, we'll try this again. Take two for the first time of an official meeting. Welcome to the House Transportation Committee here on Tuesday, January 14th. And today's and our first witness of the session is our fiscal analyst, Logan Muberry from Joint Fiscal Office, and he's going to run us through where does the transportation money come from and a bit about where it comes from, where it goes, and how it flows into a budget. And without further ado, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so as mentioned, my name is Logan Muberry. I guess for the record, my name is Logan Muberry with the Joint Fiscal Office. As just mentioned, I'm going to give you a brief sort of overview of the transportation world, talk a little bit about what we're going to do in this committee, and then talk more towards the fiscal aspect, which is what my job sort of revolves around, and talk about the money, where it comes from, where it goes, that sort of thing. Brief outline. I'll talk briefly about the process just so we understand some of the big things that this committee will be working on. And then we'll get into how we pay for transportation, a lot of that, whether there's state money, so where state money comes from, where we then spend that state money, talk briefly about federal funds, and then I'll give you some considerations, things to think about as you're listening to these presentations and whatnot in the next few weeks. Review of the process. This committee works on two sort of omnibus bills every year. There can be other smaller bills, but generally there are two main bills. The first bill being the transportation bill. We'll refer to it as the T bill from here on out, pretty much. That's a bill that starts in the House. And then you have your miscellaneous motor vehicle bill. That's a bill that deals with more technical matters on the motor vehicle law, stuff like that. That would start in the Senate. And about halfway through, they cross over. So T bill. This is the big bill that amends and approves the yearly transportation program, also known as the White Book. The White Book, for people who don't know, is proposed by the governor in the early session. We'll get that in a few weeks. And it contains all the projects that the agency is going to undertake. And it has them laid out for the next 4 years. And this is sort of their presentation. White books, they're all up there. You'll get a big binder, big white binder that has sort of everything the agency wants to work on that year and then project it out for the next 4 years. So part of your job is to go through that, see if it needs to be amended, make sure that it meets your wishes and your constituents' wishes, and make sure all that. And then essentially the first thing that happens in the T bill is we adopt this white book that they gave us. So yes, please.
Oh, pardon the interruption. I think in what we talked about in this presentation, there's a lot going to go here, and there's going to be a lot of stuff probably haven't heard for the newer members, but I think we're taking questions. We're in a pretty open spot from now until we go about 10 to 2 or so. So if you have questions, please. Please, Representative.
Just a comment. So in other committees, when you have a bill that comes and you're going to pass the bill out of committee, when we pass the transportation bill out of committee, it will be 50 pages, 60 pages, but it's not that white book gets attached to the bill when it goes out of this committee. So.
But it doesn't mean we might make changes to what's in the white bill.
Correct.
And so the bill will say,
yeah,
the white bill, except for these changes or whatever.
Yes.
I have a question on the white.
Please.
So the white book proposes what's going to happen over the next 4 years, but there's a new one every year.
Correct.
And is
Yeah.
there any looking back at like
And
last
yeah,
year's white book?
and we'll get to that briefly here. So I'll go back one. So this is getting a little into the weeds, but the T bill and your committee provides what we call spending authority to pursue the projects in that book, but it doesn't give the agency any money, right? That's done by the Appropriations Committee. So there's two parts to this, and part of my job is making sure that the things that we work on in the T bill and the money that's set aside in these white books matches the money that is being appropriated in the big bill. So I got to make sure that those two bills match. But the big bill only appropriates money for one fiscal year, for the next fiscal year. So the agency will present their white book that will have 4 years of projects, but each year they have to come back and essentially get those projects reapproved. Now, projects are big and there's a lot of money that goes into them. So for the most part, they lay out their 4 years, this is what we're going to spend, and they're generally approved. There is some sort of shifting just based on construction seasons and stuff like that, but it is approved on a year-to-year basis, but they'll give you sort of a 4-year outlook. Yeah. The T-bill can include other transportation-related policies or things not proposed by the governor, right? So part of the thing that happens is the T-bill becomes this omnibus, pretty big bill. There'll be other potential transportation initiatives that want to go in. Those, generally speaking, are taken from these other bills and all put into the T-bill. And then the T-bill is the big transportation-related bill that passes. So that's a little different than other committees where they might pass multiple bills. Again, this is not a hard rule. There is, if you want to run another bill, I don't think there's anything stopping you from doing that. This is just sort of convention. And then the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill is the other sort of large bill that you all will be working on at some point. This one makes smaller changes to motor vehicle laws, a lot of things with the DMV, headlights, rotors, inspections, that sort of thing. Less about the money, more about sort of the technical stuff. And you'll work on that sort of in the second half of the session. And then, as we'll talk about later this week, I believe, there is a mid-year adjustment, which they call the Budget Adjustment Act, or the BAA, which is essentially an opportunity to adjust the previous budget that was passed. So a little background, you might know that there are 2 forecasts every year, one in July and one in January, coming shortly. So the BAA allows for some flexibility if, say, like revenues changed or there was extra money or less money, being able to retroactively sort of change the current year budget that we're in now. So we can talk about more of that on Friday.
Where do revenue sources related to the DMV or other revenue sources live?
We'll be getting to that very shortly, yes. So how does Vermont pay for transportation? So like most states, Vermont pays for it through a mixture. We have federal funds, a lot of federal funds, state funds, and then we have local funds as well. So this chart here is sort of a breakdown of the last 3 years budgets. Starting from the bottom, the biggest number, the big orange bar, that is our federal funds. So you might not be able to see the numbers, but last year was almost $500 million in federal funds. This comprises the majority of the state's transportation funding every year. Last year was 56% of our transportation funds came from federal funds. And the thing about federal funds, which is important to remember when discussing funding, is that they almost always require a match. So usually it's an 80-20, so the federal government will pay for 80% of a project, the state has to pay for the remaining 20%. Not all things that AOT does can federal funds be used. So DMV are big ones, and maintenance. We can't use federal funds, those are almost entirely state dollars. Then we'll go into the state fund. We have 2 main funds. There is the T fund and the TIB fund, which the T fund stands for the Transportation Fund. This is the primary state funding source. This is where most of our revenue is deposited into the T fund, or the Transportation Fund. There's also the TIB fund, or the Transportation Infrastructure Bond Fund. This was created to pay for our debt service costs if we ever issue bonds. State currently doesn't have any issued bonds, so the money put into this fund can be used on a pay-as-you-go basis or appropriated every year, such as T fund dollars might be. And we can talk about that a little more in a minute. And then we have local funds. Oh, I will say the state funds is this, hopefully you can see my cursor, this blue section here. This is the other large chunk of funds. Vast majority of all funds for transportation are either federal or the state dollars. And then local funds are these little gray bar. They make up relatively small portion of the budget. and largely represent the local match portion for a project in their area. And then you'll see these other funds that I didn't mention here. These we'll get into more when we dive deep into the budget. For now, these are just, you can think of those as sort of miscellaneous funds or transfers that happen for budgetary reasons. And we'll get into all of that in more detail later. So where does state money come from? Vermont generates most of its transportation funds from 5 main areas. We have a gas tax and an assessment. We have a diesel tax and assessment. We have a vehicle purchase and use tax. We have DMV fees. Those are like licensing fees, registration fees. Sure, we've all paid them. And then we have a bunch of miscellaneous other sources. So this is a chart of the, just to give you a sort of large overview of the revenue forecast. This is the latest one from July. I won't go through all of this at this moment, but I'll point out the sort of the large picture things here. T-fund revenues, which we can see in this sort of yellow bar here. Fiscal year 26, that's the year the budget we're working on. They're estimated to be about $323 million. And then your TID fund, which are these ones down here, estimated to be about $19 million. Thing I want to make note of on this chart is if you follow some of these down, like our gasoline tax and assessment and our diesel tax and assessment, if you look at this forecasting, you'll notice we're projected to decline in our revenue intake from these funds. Purchase and use, doing pretty well, projected to grow at 3.8%. DMV fees, relatively flat. You'll see the same in the TID fund. We're expecting flat growth and a slight decrease for an overall state revenue growth, T-fund revenue growth of only 1.34%. And that goes to our bottom question here. Revenue's only grown 1.34%. Do we think costs are only going to grow 1.34%? Something to think about. This is the same information, just broken out in a little bit. You'll see the same sort of declining rates here in these two funds, increasing in these two funds. We're still growing, just slightly. So we'll get into these in a little more detail, just so we understand kind of how they work. So our gas tax and assessment is the one that's decreasing. Vermont has a hybrid gas tax system. That means we have a fixed tax portion and 2 variable assessments, which we'll get into. Why do we have a hybrid system? Generally, it allows for a degree of sensitivity. When gas prices go up, AOT's costs generally increase. They're buying more fuel at an expensive rate. We want to sort of offset maybe some reduced demand. So we raise a portion of the gas tax to sort of offset the higher costs. When they're lower, we don't need to collect as much. We're not spending as much on gasoline. That's kind of the thinking around that. So let's see, all gas tax are levied as cents per gallon at the distributor level, and they're collected by DMV monthly. This is sort of a breakdown of all the gasoline taxes. And we'll go through these in a second. So we have the fixed tax portion, which is the easy portion. You want to start at the top here. We have a total of 13.1 cents for the state, but 12 of that comes from just our fixed tax portion, and then a portion of it is split off to these other funds that get a small sliver of the gas tax. And then we have a 1 cent petroleum cleanup fee, which goes to the petroleum cleanup fund. And then that's these here. We'll skip over the assessments for a second. And then there is a federal tax levied of 18.4 cents. That has remained the same since 1993. And that goes into the federal highway trust fund, and generally comes back to states in federal funding. Let's talk briefly about the assessment. So we have 2 assessments. We have a 4% assessment that goes into the T fund, and we have a 2% assessment. Now assessments get a little weird, and they get a little into the weeds. So You don't have to remember any of this by any means. This is partially my job is doing all this stuff. So if you have any questions, but our assessments have minimums and maximums amounts that we will put in. So for example, the 4% motor fuel tax assessment has a 13.4 cent minimum and a 18 cent maximum. We will never collect less than that. We'll never collect more than that. You can see there when gas is 3.87, we're collecting our minimum. And if it drops below 3.87, we'll collect our minimum until it goes above. And if it ever goes above $5, we'll collect that maximum and never more or less. The same for the 2%, which goes into the tip fund. It only has a minimum though. There's no max on that one. And then assessments are calculated based on the tax adjusted average retail price. What does that mean? Fairly simple. You just take the retail price, subtract out the taxes you pay on it, times it by the percentage, either 4 or 2%. And that's how you sort of calculate the assessment portion of it. Again, I don't know that that will be a big thing in this committee. Maybe we want to get into that more if we want to. Happy to discuss. And then if you wanted to see how that plays out, we can look at this quarter's rates, and it's a simple calculation of just taking your average retail price, subtracting out your taxes. You get your tax adjusted price, you times it by 2%, you times it by 4%, apply your minimums if they exist. That's it. Anyways, don't worry too much about that. We will come back to that if we can. Let's talk big picture gasoline. As we know, gasoline is a major share of our revenue, and it is a major declining share of our revenue. Consumption peaked in the early 2000s, been declining ever since. It declined very sharply during COVID pandemic and has kind of never returned to that. This is likely going to continue as vehicles get more efficient and we get more EVs, electric vehicles, stuff like that. Here's a chart that maps your gallons taxed back to 1994. You'll see that peak there in the early 2000s. Declining, sharp drop off in COVID, and then it's kind of flattened out, but it's never returned to pre-pandemic levels.
And this one's available on the JFO website.
Yes.
We use about 65 million gallons less of gasoline than we did before. And so at 13 cents, just for simple math, this is one of our biggest challenges. We're only, everything that we in transportation get for revenue to what we want to then provide to Vermont for an infrastructure is not growing anywhere near what everything else is. So everything that we want to do, every extra piece, finding a place to get more money, that transportation revenue is incredibly constrained, while other revenues for state government are growing at significant rates. But what we have to work with, and there has to be a discussion on a long-term policy basis of what are we going to do, because the roads aren't going to get any cheaper to maintain, and there's pressure from lots of places to do more than what transportation does today. But what I'm trying to echo right now is what I kind of foreshadowed it a little bit earlier when we met, is at least what I like to throw out. How are we going to do more when we are in a situation where our revenues are incredibly constrained, where we can get money from into transportation is very constrained? Is that fair to say, Logan?
That's absolutely correct. Yes, there is a revenue constraint in this committee and on transportation in general. And one of the big challenges is managing, sort of wants with needs and the policies that need to be juggled between bringing down federal funds and making the best of our state dollars. So I'm sure we will get into in more detail as the budget comes out and as these things sort of progress. This will be a continuing topic for sure.
I'll point out, we did ask last year for a report on what are the options if we needed to raise funds.
Yep.
And so there is a report, I think it should be on our committee page, that came from Secretary of State and others, just outlining, here's what other states are doing. Just not saying, we go there, just show where other funds are coming, like mileage-based user fee would be one, you pay based on the number of miles. So that report is in there, and I think we'll have some discussions this year.
In the near future.
Yeah,
We
right.
certainly will.
Like,
So I'm sorry, I gotta do this because you know, I'm getting training for chairs and Tim and I have to go. If you want to raise, and I should have covered this earlier, you're raising your hand so I can say Representative White, because the people on the YouTube and the record to know who's speaking at the time, it's not anything more than that to try to make sure. So please, Representative White, but no, that's not your, I didn't set it up right. The reason we need to do it is people need to know who's speaking and be able to hear one person at a time. It's not that I didn't set a good stage to start, so I apologize for that. But I apologize for interrupting, but please, it's your floor.
just on the other revenue ideas, things like tolls on bridges, tolls on highways, I mean, is that something in the realm of possibility?
Many of those things have been looked at and many of those things are in the reports and many of those can be part of the discussion. So we're not going to do that today. We're going to try to figure out where the money's coming from today, but I guess I would say frankly, lots of things are on the table and we do have sections of the agenda. We're going to be talking about that. Representative Corker.
But I will say it can't be on the table until the federal government changes it. Because our roads weren't paid with strictly state dollars. We received federal dollars and the feds preclude us from putting tolls up. So we would need special permission. I don't think that's probably.
Yeah, to get into every one of the individual options, we will get into wormholes. There are reasons for all the things about why we don't do what we do
Yeah.
today. And, but yes, Representative McCoy.
Didn't we pass something last year for an additional fee on EVs?
Yes.
Just
The
came into
registration
effect.
fee.
Just went into registration, $89 or something like that. So we did do something last year. Yes.
Please.
It's to support the infrastructure build out of electric vehicle charging stations. It's that money from the registration, double the registration fee for EVs and half for hybrid electric vehicles. And it goes to the building of the charging infrastructure. But that's just a temporary thing until they can do the mileage-based user fee, which we'll see what happens. That I'm sure we'll have a lot of that.
Okay, we're gonna get back to, we're gonna go keep pushing forward and
Yep.
we're gonna get into all of those other subjects.
This is
There we
a,
go.
I guess, kind of fun fact or something to think about. We tax roughly 285 million gallons. If we're estimated tax, if you want to raise 1 penny tax, that'd be an additional 2.85 million additional revenue. Just diesel tax, less interesting than the gas tax. We have 2 fixed taxes on diesel plus a petroleum cleanup fee. We have a 28 cents tax that goes to the T fund. We have a 3-cent TIF assessment that goes to the TIF fund, and then the 1-cent cleanup fee for a total of 32 cents. Then the feds levy their tax to 24 cents for a total of 56 cents. And then unlike gasoline, oh, okay, we'll go here. Estimated to generate about 17.8 to the T fund and 2.1 million to the TIF fund on 67 million gallons. It's not a huge share, but it's relatively stable over time, slightly declining as trucks get more vehicle, but that is largely tied to sort of economics. A lot of diesel is interstate trucking and stuff like that. So it's a little more of a stable. And unlike gasoline, we do have a number of exemptions, which if you're interested, ag, the highway, the state doesn't pay taxes, stuff like that. So here's where we are in comparison to all the other states. You'll see Vermont is right there in the middle with their total federal and state motor fuel taxes. What I say, 51 cents, kind of right in the middle, right average. Got California on the high end and Alaska on the low end. Motor vehicle purchase and use tax. So this is one of the revenue sources that is doing okay. That is a 6% tax on the value of a motor vehicle collected by the DMV when you go to register or title your vehicle for the first time. And we will collect this tax regardless of where you buy the vehicle. When you first register it is when you will pay us. So can't go to a no tax state, get out of our purchase and use tax. There's also a 9% tax on rental charges for short-term rental vehicles. But we don't get all of the purchase and use, of the T fund doesn't, I should say. We get about 2/3 of total purchase and use tax, and then another third goes to the ed fund. So we're forecasted to generate about 1.2 million in fiscal year 26. And then, as mentioned, purchase and use collections were quite high after COVID, and they have remained substantially above sort of this pre-pandemic level. They're expected to stay relatively high and continue to grow at a decent rate. There's this trend we see back there in 04 when we did the split. There's a decrease and then decrease after 08, but then it's been growing. Short, slight decrease here in the onset of pandemic, and then this spike and growth afterwards has really been helpful to the T fund overall. Getting to the end, DMV fees. So this is fees for driver's license, vehicle registrations, all those things you got to pay to the DMV when you go. Expected to generate $1.3 million, or sorry, $103 million to the transportation fund in FY26, I believe. And these fees are set in these periodic fee bills, and the last one was just set in 2024, I guess in 2023, but went into place January 1, 2024. And then we have miscellaneous revenues. So this is a variety of different revenue sources expected to generate about 27.8 million. And it includes stuff like overweight permits, jet fuel sales, railroad incomes, traffic, civil penalties, that sort of stuff. There's a long list of little revenues here and there. Here's DMV fees if you want to see what the sort of different DMV fee bill increases throughout. This is the last one right there in January, effective January 1, 2024. But a relatively stable growing revenue source. Now, okay.
Thanks. I was hoping you'd have a chart there that shows Vermont DMV fees against the other states, similar to the gas.
I don't, but I could probably see that, yeah.
It's close to find out where we relate to other states. Please represent.
Logan, I don't know if you could compare this, but when you did your analysis there for purchase and use, when our committee made that deal back in 2004, originally there was a gas tax that went into the ed fund.
Mhm.
It'd be interesting to see how good or bad, I think it's bad, that deal was, and sort of line up the money that
Like how much additional gas.
Additional. just to compare those two, because it'd be good to maybe just have that if we wanted to make another deal, or because I got a feeling that transportation got the short end that by millions when we did that in 2004. But I'm just curious of the millions of dollars if we left it intact as opposed to making that too.
Sure, I can figure something out.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Did that. Okay, where does state money go? We've raised all this revenue. What do we do with it? Vast majority goes to fund the White Book, the projects that the agency wants to put out. That is where, especially of the state dollars, that is where 300, what's the end? 2025, $304 million state funds went to those projects, but not everything goes sort of to the agency or to those agency projects. We have a number of other appropriations and transfers that we have to make using T-Fund dollars, such as we give a transfer to BGS, Buildings General Services, for the information centers along the highways. See where that one is in here. That was $4.2 million last budget. We have a Pay Act or 27 payroll costs. That was estimated at $2.5 million. We have this, we call it JPOC appropriation, which goes to the state police every year. That's $20.25 million. Then there's recreation trip funds, downtown funds, all these sort of things. So you'll see last year, AOT appropriation was 304, total appropriations was 319, plus there's some transfers in, so and some reversions, which we can get all into that later. But it's not all of our money goes to AOT. Some of it goes out to other places. before we get in here. And then we have the TIP fund, which as we, I think, mentioned earlier, is currently being used in the same way as the T fund, slightly the same way. It's being appropriated out for projects on a sort of pay-as-you-go basis, so every year it can be appropriated out. The TIB bond and TIB bond fund are special in that they have a sort of requirement around what projects they can be used for. So they have to be used for longer lasting projects of over 10 years. And the general thinking of this is that we don't want to be bonding for things like resurfacing, right? That we'll have to do every year. So these go to mainly like bridges or big projects that'll have a long life. As I mentioned, this fund was created to cover the debt costs for any bonds that the state might issue. We don't have any bonds, so we're currently appropriating this out on a pay-as-you-go basis every year.
Representative Puck?
Yeah, thanks. So, and maybe Tim knows, what's the process if we did want a bond? So for example, infrastructure resiliency, if we wanted to bond for that, to provide more funds, so that, for example, municipalities would have money to do this with. So what's the process of doing that? We go through the Secretary of State? for that?
That's a great question, and that's definitely a topic that we were gonna take. We're gonna
Okay,
see how much Logan can get through, but I
Yeah.
totally appreciate where you're heading, and I think that's a great
Yeah.
question. You can take that as a follow-up to answer the next time we can put you on the
Yeah.
the agenda. We have a little bit of a time constraint today, unless there's maybe one or two more sections of where you send the money, and then we'll wrap up in the next.
That is where the statement goes. We're just going to talk federal funds briefly, but we can do this next time I come in. I think it's a good stopping spot if this works.
That's a stopping spot. Okay, then, thank you very much, Logan, and we're going to be adjourned for the House Transportation Committee for today. Tomorrow morning, we start at 9 o'clock with the Secretary Flynn and his lieutenants and learn the overview of the agency from the Secretary. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Logan.
Thank you.
Thank you.